Hey everybody, it's me, Bob. What you're about to see here is the pilot for what we're hoping is going to be a new potential regular series, depending on how the feedback goes, called G.E.M.s, which stands for Good Enough Movies. Think of this as sort of a companion piece to Really That Good, a bite-sized version, if you like. G.E.M.s is, in theory, a celebration of the 2.5 to 3 star movie. Movies that are fun and memorable, maybe not classics, but compulsively watchable. The kind of things that if they're on, you'll watch them and they're always just nice to have on hand. In some cases, these are people's favorite movies, much more so than outright classics tend to be. Really, the idea is to look back on these films and not so much criticize them as explore them and briefly go over why it is that even though they're not perfect, not the best movies in the world, that they're so memorable, that they stick with us, that they are our good enough movies. So this will be the first pilot. I'm going to try a few more just to iron things out, see how the response goes. Graphics and titles aren't final, but it is the general aesthetic that we're looking for. And I hope what you like to see. We're going to start off with Spaceballs, which I think is a movie that a lot of people really love and remember. So without further ado, here is the pilot for Good Enough Movies. Hope you enjoy it. Spaceballs was probably the first Mel Brooks movie that a lot of my generation actually saw, mainly because it was based on something we had an immediate frame of reference for in Star Wars, and because it wasn't nearly as adult as many of his earlier films, so it was easier for us to see it in our formative years. I don't think it's an exaggeration to suggest that this might have been the first time a lot of younger fans were exposed to the idea that deconstructing the sillier parts of a movie or a whole genre they enjoyed for satire was even a concept. Given that initial level of exposure, coupled with the tendency of Generation X and Millennial to inflate any movie in their regular VHS rotation to the levels of classic, it's hardly surprising to consider that Spaceballs might by a small margin likely be the most popular or at least frequently viewed Mel Brooks movie, and yet it's also widely condemned, mostly by those who are otherwise fans of Mel Brooks' other work. To many fans of screen comedy, Spaceballs was the start of a downturn for the legendary auteur, a rejection of the subtler depths and political nuances that informed his earlier work, and most noticeably a softer, more family-friendly, youth-targeted edge, or lack thereof, in his sensibilities. And yet, to a generation that grew up on it, and new generations who continue to be introduced to it, it's often considered a classic. Who got it right? Well, both. Kinda. Spaceballs is not the best Mel Brooks parody movie. Not only is that readily apparent, it was even more obvious when it was released, and the main films to compare it to were Young Frankenstein and Blazing Saddles, two of the best comedy films ever produced. I mean, yeah, compared to those two, Spaceballs just can't hold up at the same level. It doesn't have Blazing Saddles' level of sharp political satire or then daring explicit humor. It doesn't have the subtle, nuanced sense of subversion that Young Frankenstein has, and if you want to get into the others, it's not even really as sophisticated in its pool of references as more uneven predecessors like High Anxiety and History of the World Part 1. In many ways, Spaceballs is a much more simple endeavor for Brooks. The material that goofs on Star Wars specifically is mostly broad Mad Magazine level stuff, and the cultural gags are mostly point-and-laugh eye rolls at American pop culture of the then-current 1980s. In many ways, the actual satire at play is so gentle, compared to the way Brooks and company eviscerated the American Western in Blazing Saddles, it could easily be mistaken for a Star Wars-like movie that just happens to be a little bit funnier. And on an early DVD commentary for the film, Brooks himself outright says he thinks a lot of kids love Spaceballs without really understanding that it's supposed to be funny. They just think it's a space movie. It does have one really insightful joke, of course, but we'll come back to it, because more immediately, Brooks is absolutely right. Spaceballs is a lot of fun. The comic timing is great, the characters are memorable, the effects hold up surprisingly well, and even though the whole setup is making fun of Star Wars' reliance on the hero's journey template, it actually spells out a pretty compelling story. Lone Star is absolutely one of the all-time great comedy roles for Bill Pullman, Daphne Zuniga is a riot subverting the space princess archetype, Rick Moranis is full-stop fucking hilarious as Dark Helmet, and John Candy's take on Chewbacca as a literal human dog consistently delivers. There really isn't a bad turn in the film. Does it rely a little too much on slapstick and sight gags? Yeah, but they're pretty damn good sight gags. The whole extended bit with the rewatching the movie itself on video is a genuine moment of comic inspiration. But if you're looking for something that genuinely infuses Spaceballs with something special, you'd have to look at the merchandising sequence, which is a great bit of fourth wall breaking brilliance on its own and a terrific runner throughout the rest of the film. But beyond that, it also represents the main way the film is actually fairly unique in the Mel Brooks canon and as a comedy in its own right. See, while he was always a rebel and a troublemaker within the industry, Mel Brooks was still very very much a figure of old Hollywood, and his other parody movies reflect that. Young Frankenstein, Blazing Saddles, High Anxiety, History of the World, Men in Tights, even Dracula Dead and Loving It are all cases of Brooks applying his irreverent sensibilities to movies and movie genres that were very much his contemporaries, which, given the laws of space and time, is generally how parody works. But for Spaceballs, that paradigm is flipped. In this instance, Brooks assumed the role of a classical show business veteran having a laugh at the expense of new Hollywood, not just the ascendancy of Star Wars, but the entire blockbuster scene and the merchandise-driven multimedia world that was taking shape around it. And in that respect, it's kind of low-key fascinating to see what it is Brooks and his cohorts consider worth mocking and worth having fun with. It's a little thing, sure, but you just don't often see comedy from an older generation taking the piss out of the new kids that goes for insightful rather than get off my lawn. So if you haven't watched it in a while and you're wondering if it still holds up, yeah, it pretty much does. It might not be the best of its cycle or the best thing Mel Brooks ever did, but Spaceballs is absolutely a good enough movie. May the Schwartz be with you.